Okay, folks, I wanted to do a brief update here on the Hanford nuclear site tunnel collapse with the radioactive nuclear waste in the tunnels there that have been buried in radioactive train cars that are apparently filled with fuel rods, and we'll talk about that in a second. But according to reports, there has now been a no-fly zone implemented, and pilots have been told to avoid the area. Apparently, I'm hearing reports that there's military Chinooks positioned in the air, to highlight the no-fly zone. And so, if you remember in the last video I did on this, I talked about how it was reported that thousands of workers were warned to take cover after a tunnel collapsed there on Tuesday in a shuttered Washington, keep this in mind, it's a plutonium and uranium extraction plant that was previously used in nuclear weapons production. And the tunnel at the Hanford plant building, known as PUREX, is apparently full of contaminated particles, including radioactive train cars that transported fuel rods, according to local news reports. And I'll link you up to everything, articles and local news video coverage in the description box below. But the entire site there is apparently about half the size of Rhode Island. And Hanford is basically located just southeast of Seattle, and this 20 feet by 20 feet area, as you see in the picture here right above my head, that's the picture of the collapsed area. And the area that suffered this collapse was apparently built during the Cold War, and it sits over a tunnel which is hundreds of feet long, and apparently only 8 feet of soil covers the tunnel, and the soil appeared to have collapsed entirely into the tunnel, according to the authorities and the official reports that were released. And it goes on to talk about how the tunnels to the PUREX facility are located to the east of the facility, and they extend south. And this is information right from the Hanford website. And apparently there are 2 tunnels, and one is approximately 360 feet long, as I said in the previous video I did on this, and the other is approximately 1,700 feet long. And the tunnels were used beginning in the 1950s to store this contaminated equipment. And this 20-foot wide by 20-foot long cave-in is basically in an area where the 2 tunnels there, where they join together. So you've got a 360-foot long tunnel, a 1,700-foot long tunnel. They meet. There's a collapse right there. So basically both tunnels potentially could experience a radiological release, okay? And that these massive areas, these massive tunnels, hundreds of feet long, one over 1,000 feet, almost 2,000 feet long, the other one, filled with radioactive train cars packed with contaminated fuel rods. I mean, God have mercy. And so I'll link you up to a bunch of reports here. But if you remember, Washington Governor Jay Inslee came out and said that the Department of Energy in the White House reached out to his office after the incident. And he went on to say that this is a serious situation. And he goes on to talk about how the site went into immediate lockdown. And if you remember in the previous video I did, I talked about how a manager basically communicated to all the personnel. A message was sent out telling them to secure the ventilation in the buildings they were in and to refrain from eating or drinking anything. And in the past, these rail cars full of radioactive waste were actually driven into these tunnels and just buried, okay? And Hanford's Emergency Operations Center has been activated, according to the reports. And I believe I mentioned that in the previous video. But the longtime workers apparently think it may be the first time that this Emergency Operations Center was open for a possible radioactive release. And if you remember, I talked about how several counties adjacent to the Hanford site, you're talking Yakima, Walla Walla, Grant, and Adams counties, they participated in a conference call with the State Emergency Operations Center, And that was reported by Yakima Interim EOC Director Tony Miller. And he said, at this time, we're monitoring the winds. And if there should be a release of contamination that goes beyond the boundaries of the Hanford site, it would mean that produce would not be allowed in or out of the affected area, Miller said. Milk and the dairies in the valley would also be affected, it goes on to say. So this could be catastrophic if it's somehow not brought under control. And I pray they do get it under control, because when you're talking about, the radiation from Fukushima combined with, something like this, which is right there on the West Coast, I mean, I'll also link you up to reports talking about how Oregon came out and activated their emergency operations center after the tunnel collapses at the Hanford site. And the Oregon Health Authority and nuclear safety experts at Oregon State University, they said on Tuesday morning that Hanford is 35 miles away from Oregon. And this is a quote from Rachel Ray, who's the ODOE spokeswoman. And she said, Hanford is 35 miles away from Oregon. We are concerned about Oregonians' health, and that concerns involve the food we eat, she said. So they were concerned about all the food being contaminated by, radiation. And also, I'll link you up to another report talking about how an alert was declared at the Hanford site, and how the alert was eventually expanded to the next level, which is called a site area emergency. And there's a piece here I'll link you up with where there's video footage of them talking about this. And a site area emergency is basically declared when the event that is going on is affecting or could potentially affect personnel beyond the facility boundary. So we're seeing everything being activated in preparation for the realistic possibility of the potential large, considerable radiological release, as we'll see in the reports here. And so at this time, though, they're saying there has been no airborne radiation release. So, I mean, it's good news. I mean, it's not something to freak out over, but it's certainly not a ideal situation. I mean, this could be, as I said, catastrophic. And so the private pilots in the area have been actually told to avoid flying over Hanford entirely. And the Hanford Patrol, it says here, is working with the Federal Aviation Administration to put a formal air restriction in place until the FAA can, the Federal Aviation Administration can confirm there is no danger. And Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington said that we need to understand whether there has been any environmental contamination resulting from the subsidence at these tunnels. And in a quote here from Edwin Lyman, who is a senior scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists, he said, and I quote, "It appears that this is a potentially serious event." And he goes on to say, collapse of the earth covering the tunnels could lead to a considerable radiological release. And so there you have it, folks. I'll link you up to news broadcasts from all kinds of local news outlets and some other reports, so you can check it out if you want to, if you live in the area and you're looking for information. But if you live in the area, you've probably been informed, I would hope anyways. And so there you have it, folks. And keep in mind, too, that this collapse is where these two massive tunnels interact. This collapse right here, there's tunnels, boom, and boom, and they interact right here. And these tunnels, one is 1,700 feet long, one's 360 feet long, and they're filled with like rail cars from a train packed with radioactive fuel rods, contaminated particles. I mean, this is a serious, serious situation. I'll include the links below, my friends. I just wanted to do an update. For those of you that I spoke with very briefly who are near the area, pray you're safe. pray everyone in Hanford is safe, and the surrounding area, of course, and I pray they get this under control. So I'll finish with that. The links are below, my friends. Much love, and God bless you guys. That was previously used in nuclear weapons production. And the tunnel at the Hanford plant building, known as PUREX, is apparently full of contaminated particles, including radioactive train cars that transported fuel rods, according to local news reports. And I'll link you up to everything, articles and local news video coverage in the description box below. But the entire site there is apparently about half the size of Rhode Island. And Hanford is basically located just so. If you remember in the last video I did on this, I talked about how it was reported that thousands of workers were warned to take cover after a tunnel collapsed there on Tuesday in a shuttered Washington. And it's, keep this in mind, it's a plutonium and uranium extraction plant. Okay, folks, I wanted to do a brief update here on the Hanford nuclear site tunnel collapse with the radioactive nuclear waste in the tunnels there that have been buried in radioactive train cars that are apparently filled with fuel rods, and we'll talk about that in a second. But according to reports, there has now been a no-fly zone implemented, and pilots have been told to, avoid the area. Apparently, I'm hearing reports that there's military Chinooks positioned in the air, to highlight the no-fly zone. And so